So, good morning. We are now on our lesson 2. Kindly write your name on the comment box so I can say your names. So, few minutes from now, we will start with our lesson 2. We really have to take time because, we've been so busy this past few weeks and we missed some important lessons. Kindly inform others to get online. Please write your name on the comment box for you to be recognized and for your attendance will be checked through our comment box. So welcome BS Criminology 1A, 1B, 1C, 1F, 1E. Okay, so same thing. If you want to recite, if you want to say something, I will give the link on the comment box so you might be appeared in our screen. Okay, same thing like what we did last meeting. If you want to answer or if you want to say something, you have to click the link that I'll be giving later on. Okay, shall we start? So, good morning everyone. We are now on the lesson 2 and readings in Philippine history. So, we have here, okay. All right, so before we start, anyone will be sending the slide or the link here. Okay. So I want 5 students to answer this question. Before we start, anyone who could still remember or who can recapitulate what was our previous lesson? Anybody before we continue? as a form of flashback. Let us first take some glimpse with the previous lesson we had. If you want to answer, just click the link that I've sent on the comment box. The link is there. What was the previous lesson we had? Anybody? Anybody open? Anyone who could answer my question before we continue? What was our previous lesson? I mean, what are the things that we discussed last meeting? Anybody? Nakalimutan niyo ng lesson natin. What was our previous lesson? Anyone from the group? Oh, nobody knows? Okay, good. We have one student. Yes, Sigusho.
About history and historiography, sir.
Yes, Sigusho.
Um, Nang our topic last meeting, sir, about history and historiography.
So what have you learned about that? What's the difference between history and historiography?
Um, the history is more analysis of facts, but and the historiography, you will be critical thinker because it's more on analysis, sir.
Okay, very good. You're from what section, Sigusho? Base Cream.
1F, sir.
Okay, Base Cream 1F. Okay, thank you. And Bilaras, say something. Liame Balyaras. Balyaras, would you like to say something? You're out of the blue. Okay. Catherine Sentinta. Catherine Sentinta, would you like to say something? All right. So ganito lang gawin natin. Since most of you have poor internet connection, please comment down your answer. Okay? So ganito lang yung gawin natin. If I would ask something, please comment down your answer on the comment box. Again, you don't have to go online, or you don't have, since we will consider your poor internet connection. So I guess the best thing to do is just write your answer on the comment box. Wag sa GC ha, sa comment box natin. Again, write your answer on the comment box. So lahat ng gustong magsagot about what is the previous lesson, just comment down your answer. Okay? Is it clear? Comment down your answer if you want to answer, if you want to say something, so that you can save your data. Okay? Okay ba? Okay, let's move on. Comment down your answer again. You don't have to go online. We will consider the internet connection we had. We're all suffering from this kind of, poor internet connection we had. All right, so we are now on the lesson 2 of readings in Philippine history. As what I've said, we'll be learning a lot of things here, and it's more on the analysis. No, it's not just simply defining what is history, but in here we will be interpreting some studies, some articles from different authors with regard to learning history or studying about history. So, as a narrative, any history that has been taught and written is always intended for a certain group of audience. So, we have here our ilustrados. So, who are these ilustrados? Ito yung mga ilustrados in the earlier times. We have Jose Rizal, Isabelo de los Reyes, and Pedro Paterno, who wrote history. So, they are the ilustrado, Jose Rizal, Isabelo de los Reyes, Pedro Paterno, who wrote history. They intended it for the Spaniards so that they would realize that Filipinos are people of their own intellect and culture. So what's the purpose why these Ilustrados wrote something? Because they wanted to show to Spaniards that we Filipinos, we have, we have intelligence. We have the power to fight against them. We have something in us that, they should be afraid of. And for them to be aware that Filipinos are intellectual, that we have this kind of intelligence. When American historians depicted Filipino people as uncivilized in their publications, they intended that narrative for their fellow Americans to justify their colonization of the islands. So early before, we are being called as uncivilized by the American, which is being written in their publication. So sa tingin nyo, bakit ka tinawag na uncivilized ang mga Pilipino? Anybody? If you know the answer, just comment down on the comment section. Again, why is it that American called us uncivilized? What do you think is the reason behind? Okay, comment down your answer. Why Filipinos are being called uncivilized? Okay, if you know the answer, just comment down. Okay, so they intended, okay. They wanted the colonization to appear not as a means of undermining the Philippines' sovereignty, but as a civilizing mission to fulfill what they called as the white man's burden. So what do you mean by this white man's burden? So this is the main reason why, one of the reasons why American colonizes, because of this, what they call white man's burden. The same is true for nations which prescribe officially or official versions of their history like North Korea, the Nazi Germany during the war period, and Thailand. The same was attempted by Marcos in the Philippines during the 1970s. So what do you mean by this? White man's burden. We will know what this word means or what this burden all about as we go along. So we have here post-colonialism. So post-colonialism is a school of thought that emerged in the early 20th century when formerly colonized nations grappled with the idea of creating their identities and understanding their societies against the shadow of their colonial past. So from the word post, no? Post mean after. Post-colonialism means after colonization or pagkatapos ng pananakop. So in here, we'll be understanding or we'll be learning who we are after colonization. Sino ba tayo ngayon, no? Anyway, today, we are now part of this post-colonialism because we're been through, no? We have been through or we're done with colonialism. So what do you think are the effects of this post-colonialism to us? Of course, as of today, we are bearing the culture of others. We have mixed culture. Uh, we are patronizing the, especially in religion, we are embracing Christianity, where in fact Christianity is a result of colonization. Okay? Now, post-colonial history looks at two things in writing history. First, to tell the history of their nation that will highlight their identity free from the colonial discourse and knowledge. So again, one of the purpose of the school post-colonization is to tell the history of their nation that will highlight their identity from that colonial discourse and knowledge. And okay, so yeah, no, who we are, what is our identity right after this colonization? Sino na ba tayo ngayon? Who we are, the way we dress up, the way we, um, the way we adopt religion. So it has something to do with post-colonization. Then, second is to criticize the methods, effects, and idea of colonialism. So another focus of post-colonialism is to criticize. When I say criticize, so dito na no, pag-aralan, analyze the methods, how are we being colonized in the past, what were the effects of this. Of course, ang daming mga Pilipino yung namatay, ang daming Pilipino yung they became slaves and traumatized, no? They are being traumatized. Even up to this day, no, may mga Pilipino, especially yung mga lola natin, wherein they were there during the colonization, during the World War II, World War One, and they know how, maybe as of today, we don't have any idea how does it feel. But if we ask our grandparents, so andun, no, andun yung takot, yung fear nila, then kaya minsan we cannot blame them, no? They are afraid, especially for those who live in the mountainous area. No? Pag may mga taong papunta doon na mga bago, mga stranger, they are afraid because they are being traumatized with this colonization. Kasi masyadong hindi maganda yung buhay ng mga Pilipino during colonization. Walang kalayaan, walang karapatan, lahat is puppet, no? Hawak sa leeg. Dapat sunod-sunuran tayo, and that's actually terrible, no? That's the terrible aspect of being colonized. And the idea of colonialism, no? Ano ba talaga ang colonialism? Who started colonialism? We all know that we've been colonized for 333 years. Now, post-colonial history is therefore a reaction and an alternative to the colonial history that colonial powers created and taught to their subject. So we have here this post-colonial history. So um, it's about studying the life of people, the life of Filipino after post-colonialism, after the colonization. So okay, that's why this subject is part of our lesson. No, it's part of our lesson actually. So on the other hand, so nagkamali tayo. Dito muna tayo. So we have here history and the historian. So ano ba yung relationship ng history and historian? Of course, history is the study, whereas historian is the ones who study history. So they are indispensable. They are interrelated. So if history written with agenda or heavily influenced by the historian, is it possible to come up with an absolute historical truth? Is history an objective discipline? If it's not, is it still worthwhile to study history? Of course, is it worthwhile? No, it is worthwhile because we have something, no? We really have to learn something about history. So that makes it worthwhile. So these questions have haunted historians for many generations. Indeed, an exact and accurate account of the past is impossible for a very simple reason that we cannot go back to the past. Yes, we cannot go back to the past, but we can study the past with, the use of documents, with the use of artifacts. So we are learning history. We cannot access the past directly as our subject matter. Historians only get to access representation of the past through historical sources and evidence. Ito. Kumbaga, although we are not there in the past, during those times na nangyari yung mga colonization, pero yung mga ebidensya, yung mga historical sources na meron tayo ngayon, yun yung mga nakakatulong sa atin that we study history. And these things bring us to the past. Although, we cannot get back or, pag past is past, diba? Sabi nga nila. So, we cannot bring back the past. But we've learned or we could learn from the past. Therefore, it is the historian's job not just to seek historical evidences and facts, but also to interpret these facts. So, the role of historian is not only about seeking or hindi lang basta paghanap ng mga ebidensya, but they are also what? Responsible to interpret these facts. So sila yung may kaalaman na kung paano i-interpret yung facts. Paano, before we come up with the certain things, totoo ba itong mga facts na to? Are there fakes, no? Especially ngayon, no, ang dami ng mga fakes. And if you're watching TV, may mga scam ngayon na yung mga ginto is they fake golds. Kaya sabi nga doon, hindi lahat ng kumikinang ay ginto. So, ibig sabihin, hindi lahat ng mga artifacts ay totoo. Yung ibang art kasi ngayon, alam mo naman, or alam nyo naman ng artifacts, kapag may nakitang artifacts, mahal ang halaga niyan kasi bibilhin niya ng mga historian, ng mga museum, ng mga archaeologists. Kaya yung ginagawa ng iba, they fake these artifacts. So, mahalaga pa rin na makuha natin yung mga totoo, yung mga legit, yung mga authentic talaga na mga evidence kasi dito nakasalala yung interpretation natin about the past. So for example, mali yung nakuha nating artifacts, then mali, ibig sabihin mali yung interpretation kasi nga nakarely lang tayo sa ating artifacts kasi nga we were not there. Hindi natin na-witness kung anong nangyari talaga in the past. So only the historians and the historical facts, the evidence that will prove them that they really existed in the past or they did not. Ganun lang, no? Facts cannot speak for themselves. Of course, they are objects, therefore, but they could not explain themselves. But it is the job of the historian to give meaning to these facts and organize them into a timeline, establish causes and history. Of course, it's the role of the historian to discuss or to interpret these artifacts. Kailan ito nangyari, paano ito nangyari, no? Ilang taon na ba itong buto na to? So, then that's it. Now, meanwhile, the historian is not a blank paper who mechanically interprets and analyzes present historical fact. He is a person of his own, who is influenced by his own context, environment, ideology, education, influences, among others. So that's it, no? So if you are an historian, you are influenced by the context, the environment that you are studying with, your ideology, yung paniniwala, yung, syempre, if you are an historian, you have your education. In that sense, his interpretation of the historical fact is affected by his context and circumstances. So ito yung naging problema for the historian. No? Minsan, for example, the historian is an Ilocano. So kapag Ilocano siya, so most probably yung isusulat niya is favorable sa mga Ilocano, no? Kasi nga this is another problem. Kasi yung mga historia natin, they are becoming subjective. Kapag subjective sila, masyado it's being subjective or objective. Kapag objective ka naman, you are being transparent, no? You follow standard. But if you are subjective, you are what? Focusing on your own, your ideology, your environment. So yan yung naging problema. Then, his subjectivity will inevitably influence the process of his historical research. So yun ay no. Yung pagiging subjective niya could really affect his historical research. Now, the methodology that he will use, the facts that he shall select, and the deem relevant, his interpretation and event, the form of his writing. So yun yung naging problema. Siyempre, for example, ikaw, isa kang Ilonggo. So kung ano yung paniniwala ng Ilonggo, so parang doon nakabase yung mga writings mo. And most likely, yung belief mo is aligned with the belief of Ilonggo. So doon naging subjective, kumbaga naging bias, no? Naging bias, naging subjective yung writer. But if you're really a writer naman or historian, so kung ano talagang totoo, dapat yun talagang i-publish, no? Even if you're not, like what American did. Yung mga American writer tayo, although they are not Filipinos, but, they are being transparent. They write what really happened in the past. But there are some naman na they are, they are subjective. Thus, in one way or another, history is always subjective. If that is so, can history still be considered as an academic and scientific inquiry? Can we consider? Okay, let's find out. Now, historical research requires rigor despite the fact that historians cannot ascertain absolute objectivity. The study of history remains scientific because of the rigor of research and methodology that historians employ. So, yes. Now, historical methodology comprises certain techniques and rules that historians follow in order to properly utilize sources and historical evidences in writing history. Alright, as an historian, you have the research and you have to utilize sources and historical evidence. Gagamitin mo ito ng tama ngayon, how and interpret them because these things can help us understand kung ano talaga yung nangyari in the past. So, as what the first stanza mentioned, it's natural though. It's innate to an historian becoming subjective. Kasi hindi maiwasan yung pagiging subjective ng isang historian. Now, certain rules apply in cases of conflicting accounts in different sources and how to properly treat eyewitness accounts and oral sources as valid historical evidence. In doing so, historical claims done by historians and the arguments that they forward in their historical writings, while may be influenced by the historian's inclinations, can be validated by using reliable evidences and employing correct and meticulous historical methodology. So nagiging valid yung claims ng isang historian employing meticulous historical methodology. So andito na yung mga process. Kumbaga ito na yung analysis. We have to analyze. Although may mga na-provide man ng mga evidence, ng mga artifacts, but we still have to analyze them. Employing correct and meticulous. Kapag meticulous yung isang methodology, ibig sabihin, may ed ba? Kumbaga, into two. Kumbaga, you really have to check both internal yung panlabas at panloob ng kanyuan ng isang bagay. So that's being meticulous. No? Because being meticulous can help us really know kung ano talaga yung totoo, ano talaga nangyari in the past. Kasi kapag hindi tayo meticulous, especially in our lives today, if you're not meticulous, maaari tayong maloko, di ba? For example, may pumunta sa bahay mo, then binentahan ka ng gold kasi looking gold. Then ngayon hindi ka meticulous. Hindi ka dumaan sa testing, hindi mo pinatest yung sample. So, pwede kang mga loko, no? Kasi you're not being meticulous and you did not apply any historical methodology. So, yun yung naging problema. Okay? So, kaya tayo ngayon, we have to be meticulous. Now, we have the Annales School of History. So, earlier we discussed about post-colonialism. Now, we have the Annales School of History. Ano kayang meron sa Annales School of History na to? Now, Annales School of History is a school of history born in France that challenged the canons of history. This school of thought did away with the common historical subjects that were almost, always related to the conduct of states and monarchs. Annales scholars like Lucien Febvre, Marc Bloch, Ferdinand Braudel, and Jacques Le Goff studied other subjects in a historical manner. They were concerned with social history and studied longer historical period. For example, Annales scholars studied the history of peasantry, the history of medicine, or even the history of environment. The history from below was pioneered by the same scholar. They advocated that the school and classes, or the people and classes who were not reflected in the history of the society in a grand manner, be provided with space in the records of mankind. In doing this, analyst thinkers married history with other disciplines like geography, anthropology, and archaeology, even linguistics. So ano ngayon ang Annales School of History? So dito sa Annales School of History, maraming mga disciplines na yung sinalin. Kaya nga, it's being mentioned here, Annales thinker married. So, kumbaga, inasawa na ng Annales School of History yung other discipline tulad ng geography. So geography is the study of the study of the earth's land's formation, yung mga anyong lupa. How about anthropology? They are focused on what? The fossils, no? And archaeology and even linguistics. So alam na natin linguistics, their focus is on the language, no? The language. So ito yung naging kaibahan ng Annales School of History kasi dito maraming mga disciplines na yung sinali. Hindi lang about history, but they included geography, anthropology, archaeology, and linguistics. For example, if a historian chooses to use an oral account as his data in studying the ethnic history of Ifugaos in the Cordilleras during the American occupation, he needs to validate the claims of his informant through comparing and corroborating it with written sources. So ito na yung mga example ng pag-aaral ng pag-apply ng ibang discipline ng Annales School of History. Therefore, while bias is inevitable, the historian can balance this out by relying to the evidences that back up his claim. So as what we've said before, if you want to claim something, if you want to assert something, it should be backed up by a certain evidence. Now, in this sense, the historian need not let his bias blind his judgment, and such bias is only acceptable if he maintains his rigor as a researcher. So dapat we are rigorous, no? We know what's right. We have this integrity, you know? And we are honest. We must be honest. Huwag natin i-falsify yung history. Kasi nga, it will affect the interpretation will be changed. Mag-iiba na yung pananaw natin if they are being changed. So yun ang halimbawa nung archaeology pag-aaral, for example, ng Ifugao, pagkuha sa mga data, mga artifacts from this place, from Cordillera. So that's the way how Annales School of History studies history. They integrate other discipline. Now, historical sources. With the past as history subject matter, the historian's most important research tool are historical sources. So, kung mga sundalo ay merong mga guns as their important tools, for the history naman or historian, historical sources are their important tools. Because they could not say something, how could they write history if they don't have historical sources? Paano maging legit? Paano maging valid yung kanilang claims? Pag sinabi nilang, Rizal was then born in Laguna. Rizal went to Europe, France. So how could they, validate that kung walang mga historical sources or evidence? So in general, historical sources can be classified between primary and secondary sources. So there are two kinds of historical sources, the primary and secondary sources. The classification of sources between these two categories depends on the historical subject being studied. So nakadepende yung category ng isang pag-aaral o ng isang source. Depende sa pag-aaral o sa focus ng pag-aaral. Now, una, we have primary sources. So what are primary sources? Ano bang meron sa primary sources? So primary sources are those sources produced at the same time at the event, period, or subject being studied. So from the word primary, ibig sabihin una talaga siya, no? So let's find out paano. This is very important to you because you are a criminology student. You should know how to differentiate ano ba yung kaibahan ng primary and secondary sources. For example, if a historian wishes to study the Commonwealth Constitution Convention of 1935, his primary source can include the minutes of the convention, newspaper clippings, Philippine Commission reports of the U.S. Commissioners' records of the convention, the draft of the Constitution, and the photographs of the event. So eyewitness accounts of the convention, delegates, and their memoir can also be used. That's pronounced as memoir, not memoir. Can also use as primary sources. Ano itong mga memoir? Ito yung ah, parang mga journal na kung saan sinulat sila is during talaga ng pangyayari. For example, nagkaroon ng meeting. So, yung mga nag-take down notes, yung mga memoir na nagawa, they are considered as primary source. For example, nagkaroon kayo ng meeting sa inyong classroom, then somebody take down notes. So, yung sinulat ng klase nyo, ng sekretary nyo, that can be considered as primary source. Kasi ikaw yung una talaga na witness mo yung, kaya nga eyewitness. For example, another thing, ikaw na isang witness, napanood or nakita mo na or na-witness mo yung pagpaslang. So ikaw ngayon ay consider as yung iyong nakita ay, so kapag ikaw ngayon ay magkukwento na, you are considered as the primary source. Kasi andun ka mismo sa napangyarihan ng isang krimen or anumang mga gawain. Now, the same goes with other subjects of historical study. Archival documents, ito yung mga halimbawa ng primary source. Archival documents, we have artifacts, we have memorabilia, letters, census, and government records, among others, are the most common example of primary source. Bakit sila na-consider na primary source? Kasi nga, they document event right away. Kumbaga, sila yung first na nakadocument ng pangyayari. Yung mga census, di ba? When they have survey, yung result ng survey nila, that's primary source. Yung mga artifacts, kasi ang artifact na to is nagamit talaga or this was present in the past na preserve lang up to this day. So that's considered as primary source. Then yung mga government records, yung mga document ng ating government, they are considered as primary source. So yun ang primary source. How about secondary source? Ano kaya? On the other hand, secondary source are those sources which were produced by an author who used primary source to produce the material. In other words, secondary source are historical sources which studied a certain historical subject. For example, on the subject of the Philippine Revolution of 1896, students can read Teodoro Agoncillo Revolt of the Masses, the story of Bonifacio and the Katipunan, published originally in 1956. The Philippine Revolution happened in the last year of the 19th century. So in other words, kapag ikaw ay secondary source, ibig sabihin, nag-rely ka lang sa primary source. For example, yung chismosa mong classmate. Dahil yung chismosa mong classmate, nakita niya yung kaibigan niya na may ginawa, then, i-chismis niya ngayon sa'yo. So, si friend mo na naka-witness nung pangyayari, siya yung primary source. Then, ikaw na nakinig, pinasahan ng balita, okay lang sana kung hindi fake news, ikaw yung secondary source. Then, ngayon, pinasa niyo yung mga balita, then mali, pareho kayong napriso, di ba? Parang ganun yung cycle. Another thing, for example, merong government record ang Takurong. For example, may nangyari sa Takurong na, that is really historical. Then ngayon nakita mo, binasa mo. Then isusulat mo naman. So yung interpretation mo ngayon, pasok na siya sa secondary source, hindi na primary source. Although ikaw yung nakapulot ng government record, pero hindi ikaw sumulat. Kasi that's considered first primary or the first document. So everything that we read, yung manabasa natin from a primary source, that's considered as secondary source. More than this, in writing the book, Agoncillo used primary source. Yes, pag we are writing a book, then we rely on a certain facts. Nag-rely tayo sa mga certain facts. Then, we are using primary or secondary source. Um, what else? Gonzalo used primary source with his research like documents of Katipunan. Siyempre, consider na as secondary. Kasi document yun ng Katipunan. So yung document na yun is primary. Pero ngayon ikaw, you read these sources, then binasa mo naman ulit or isusulat mo, that's secondary source na siya ngayon. And the correspondence between among or between and among Katipuneros. So now, naintindihan nyo what is the difference between primary and secondary source. Of course, kapag primary, yan yung mga government records, yung mga eyewitness, yung andun ka sa pangyayari, yung mga artifacts. Whereas secondary source is, for example, you are reading the books na ngayon or pinasahan ka nung first primary source. So that's considered as secondary source. For example, we are studying artifacts, then isusulat natin ngayon yung napag-aralan natin through artifacts. So yan na yan siya consider as secondary source. However, a student should not be confused about what counts as primary or secondary source. As mentioned above, the classification of the sources between primary and secondary depends not on the period when the source was produced or the type of the source, but on the subject of the historical research. So, hindi nag-matter dito kung kailan siya ginawa or kailan ito nangyari, kailan siya nakuha. But what matters is the thing, the subject or the idea that we can get from this source. So, hindi siya nag-matter, no? So, kahit primary source siya, it's still considered. Or kahit is it secondary source, as long as legit yung pinagmulan, that could still be considered. For example, a textbook is usually classified as secondary source. Ayan, yung textbook natin. That's secondary source. A tertiary source even. However, this classification is usual but not automatic. If a historian chooses to write the history of education in 1980s, he can utilize textbooks used in the period as a primary source. If a historian wishes to study historiography of the Philippine American War, for example, he can use works of different authors on the topic as his primary source as well. Both primary and secondary sources are useful in writing and learning history. Okay, so hindi siya nag-matter. We just classify here the different or what is primary and what is secondary. But they are both acceptable. They are both acceptable. Especially if they are from an authentic kind of event or artifacts. Lahat sila makonsider. However, historians and students of history need to thoroughly scrutinize these historical sources to avoid deception and to come up with historical truth. So yun ang sabi ko na kailangan siya scrutinize. Kailangan pag-aralan. Kailangan dumaan sa mga different methodologies. Okay? For us to prove that they are really true or not. Now, the historian should be able to conduct an external and internal criticism of the source, especially primary source, which can age in century. So we are now on the kind of criticism. What is criticism, by the way? Criticism is a process wherein we are going to assess, we are going to criticize a certain thing kung totoo ba. For example, ikaw, when you criticize your classmate, paano mo ba i-criticize yung classmate mo? Paano mo ba sabi na, matalino siya, di ba? That's criticism. Paano mo sabi na mayaman siya? Maganda siya manamit, di ba? Paano mo sabi matalino siya? Magaling siya mag-recite, magaling siya magsulat. So that's your way of criticizing something. So paano masabi na, kasi may haka-haka na aswang yung kapitbahay mo. So how can you prove? Kasi hindi mo dapat basta-basta i-accuse that she is that kind of, aswang, or saying that your classmate is, kind of kawatan. Maraming accusation kasi yung ginagawa natin. So we have to criticize them using external and internal criticism. So what is external criticism? External criticism is the practice of verifying the authenticity of evidence by examining its physical characteristic. From the word external, ibig sabihin, we are more focused on the physical aspect of an object or of an certain evidence or artifacts. Kapag gold, for example, tingnan namin yung physical niya, okay, check, kasi kumikinang. Pero tandaan nyo, hindi na lahat ng kumikinang ay ginto. Ha? So, yun yung external criticism. Consistency with the historical characteristics of the time when it was produced and the materials used for the evidence. Example of the things that we will be examining when conducting historical criticism or document include the quality of the paper. O, for example, paano masabi na ito ay sulat ni Rizal. Baka yung ginamit niyang papel ay intermediate. Baka linen paper. So, syempre, hindi na siya, no? Kasi linen paper and intermediate, they are found in today's milieu na siya, no? Hindi siya part of the past. The type of ink na ginamit, baka pilot ink ang ginamit, hindi pala ito ink ni Rizal. Hindi pala ito mga sinaunang ink. So, dapat mo ngayon i-criticize using external criticism or assess. The language and words used in the material among others. Ano yung mga language na ginamit? Yung dialektong ginamit. Baka British English, hindi na siya part ng past. Kasi ang mga Pilipino dati, we all know, we use Alibata, Spanish, no? And among others. So, external criticism. How about internal criticism? Ano kaya ang internal criticism? Internal criticism, on the other hand, is the examination of the truthfulness of evidence. It looks at the content. So, ang pinaka-focus ngayon ng internal criticism is on the content, yung nilalaman ng isang balita, nilalaman ng isang artifacts, nilalaman ng isang dokumento. Internal criticism looks at the truthfulness. Gaano ba katotoo yung nilalaman? Baka chismis lang yan, baka hindi siya factual. And factuality of the evidence by looking at the author of the source, its content, the agenda behind its creation, the knowledge which informed it, and its intended purpose among others. So, kailangan mo i-criticize din, hindi lang yung content, but also the source. Saan niya ba kinuha? Kaya bago kayo mag-chismis, dapat alam nyo kung saan ito nagmula. From legit ba or not? So, you should know that. And the agenda behind, and the author himself, legit kaya siya na author. Kaya minsan, especially sa mga balita today, we are really, fake news is rampant. Fake news is everywhere. Ang daming mga fake news. And worst is, it affects the lives of Filipino. Ang daming taong nagrarate, especially. Yung 2012 daw, end of the world na, but it's not. So, we have to criticize these things before we believe. Kaya minsan, kung may chismis kang narinig about your partner, na ganito, may iba siya, tapos wala kang ebidensya, di naniniwala ka sa kanila. So, ibig sabihin, you are not meticulous. Hindi ka na rin meticulous. And it's unfair. It's unfair sa part ng partner mo because you doubt him and you prejudge him without knowing what is really true. So, dapat ganun din sa history. Before we interpret something, before natin sabihin na ganito yung nangyari, si Rizal, ganyan, it should be what? It should be supported by evidence na dumaan sa internal and external criticism. So we have here example. Japanese reports and declarations during the period of the war should not be taken as historical fact hastily. Internal criticism entails that the historian acknowledge and analyze how much reports can be manipulated to be used as war propaganda. Validating historical sources is important because the use of unverified, falsified, and untruthfulness historical sources can lead to equally false conclusion. Ito na yung sinasabi ko kanina. Kapag mali-mali yung mga evidence, hindi siya dumaan sa meticulous na analysis, we would end up with false Conclusion. Okay, ganito pala. Diba? Ay, totoong may iba siya. Ay, totoong aswang si ganito. But, di tayo sure that these things are really true. No? Kaya dapat we should be careful, especially today. And especially if all of you will become professional. You should always know what is truth, and especially kayo, your future peacemaker. Baka may tao dyan dahil may chismis, huhulihin nyo. That's not good. But alamin nyo na, it should be what? It should undergo process. It should undergo process before nyo gagawin. Or it should undergo some, yun nga, criticism, internal and external. Without thorough criticism, historical evidences, historical deceptions and lies will be highly probable. Kapag walang criticism sa isang historical evidences, lahat ng mga mapapublish ay mga kasinungalingan. Puro kasinungalingan lamang, and they are not, they are not legit. Kasi hindi dumaan sa pagsusuri. Okay? So again, external and internal criticism. Kapag external, it's the physical aspect of a certain thing, object. Kapag internal naman, more focus on the content. Ano ba yung nilalaman ng isang pahayag or ng isang historical evidence. No? That's it. I hope you understood. Because later on, we'll have activity on this lesson. Kaya, handa na kayo. Malapit na matapos. So after this, we'll have recitation kapag may time pa tayo mamaya. So, handa-handa na kayo. Okay. Let's ask first. Maybe you have a question. All right. So any question? I will give here the link. So earlier we discussed about the difference between primary and secondary source and the difference between internal or external and internal criticism. Kaya tayo guys, you students, you must be meticulous, no? Act professionally. Huwag maniwala agad sa chismis without any evidence. Kasi minsan kapag we rely on this hoax without knowing what really happened, maaring babalik sa atin ang accusation, no? Kasuhan tayo ng libel, moral damage, because we publish something that we are not sure of. That's why we really have to apply what we have learned here in Readings in Philippine History. We have to be meticulous. We have to follow process methodology. We have to use both internal, external, the primary and secondary source to support our claims or to support our accusation. Because if we don't apply them, if we're not meticulous in all our deeds, tayo yung kawawa at the end of the day. No? Maniniwala tayo sa isang kasinungalingan. So ganito na lang, no? Mamaya na lang ang ating recitation right after our discussion na lang. Okay? So, I guess no more clarification or questions. Okay, moving on. Move tayo. Now, so one of the scandalous cases of deception in the Philippine history is the hoax. Ito na, sinasabi kong hoax. What do you mean by the word hoax? Hoax means sabi-sabi lang, fake news, chismis, hoax of Code of Calentiao. The code was a set of rules contained in an epic, Maragtas, which was allegedly written by a certain Datu Kalanchaw. The document was sold to the National Library and was regarded as an important pre-colonial document until 1968, when American historian William Henry Scott debunked the authenticity of the code due to the anachronism and lack of evidence to prove that the code existed in the pre-colonial Philippine society. So ito na ngayon, dahil hindi dumaan sa criticism ang Code of Kalanchaw, so isang magaling na historian na si William Henry Scott ngayon ang, kumbaga, he rejected, he um, he debunked, no? He debunked means he debunked is parang pinawalang bisa yung pagiging authentic ng Code of Kalanchaw. Kasi nga, according to him, it has lack of evidence. Walang ebidensya ang Code of Kalanchaw na nangyari talaga. That's why it's called hoax. Hindi totoo. Gawa-gawa lamang. No? It's hoax. It's hoax. And lack of evidence, the code, okay. To prove that the code existed in pre-colonial Philippine society. So, kumbaga, gi-question ni William Henry Scott yung pagiging authentic ng Code of Kalanchaw kasi nga it has or it was not supported by document. Ito na yung sinabi ko kanina. Before we claim something, we assert something, it should be supported by evidences dapat. No? We should always stick with evidences. Kasi ito lang yung makakasupport sa atin that they are really true or not. Then kapag may taong matalino, din nalaman niya, critic niya ngayon yung gawa mo. And he or she finds out that there's something wrong with this, so wala kang magagawa. Kapag sinabi niyang hindi totoo, so hindi ka maka-assert because you have no evidence to say na totoo yung claims mo. Kaya in everything we do, class, we should always have evidence. Dapat lahat documented, lahat dapat may ebidensya, hindi yung chismis lang, no? Kasi hindi tayo matutulungan ng chismis. Okay. Ferdinand Marcos also claimed that he was a decorated World War II soldier who led a guerrilla unit called Ang Maharlika. This was widely believed by students of history, and Marcos had war medals to show. This claim, however, was disproven when historians counter-checked Marcos' claims with the war records of the United States. These cases prove how deceptions can propagate without rigorous historical research. Okay, another example. So ito nangyari kay Marcos that he claimed na andun siya sa World War II, not that he was a soldier who led the group of Maharlika. But then, when somebody counter-checked, or a certain historian counter-checked it, this was shown na hindi totoo. O, this was proven when historian counter-checked Marcos' claim with the war records. Although, may pinakita si Marcos ng mga medal. Kasi nga, na-prove na hindi totoo, although may pinakita siya mga medal, siguro or maybe, hindi totoo yung mga ebidensya niya. Kaya kailangan natin gamitan ng internal and external criticism. So maybe this certain author or certain historian use both internal and external criticism. That's why they counter-check it and they found out this was not true. Nagawa lang ito ni Marcos. So see, that's the effect. That's the effect of, being meticulous or being aware of using both internal and external criticism. So, pwedeng i-invalidate yung ating claims kapag wala tayong evidence. But we can also prove the truth, or we can, tell the truth and tell to everybody that this is really true if we have this evidence. Now, the task of historian is to look at the available historical sources and select the most relevant and meaningful for history and for the subject matter that he is studying. So ito yung papel ng isang historia na maghanap ng mga historical sources. And hindi lang basta maghanap, but they have to select the most relevant. Piliin yung totoo, yung tama, at yung magagamit talaga in studying history. Aanhin naman kung maraming sources na hindi naman nakakatulong, di ba? So, it's a role or responsibility of a certain historian to select and to collect and select. Di ba? Parang relasyon din yan. Naghanap ka ng shota, pero minsan, out from your collection, you have to choose one. Who is the best? Parang competition din ang gawain ng mga historian. There are many winners, but they have to select the most, the top one, who is really the winner. And same as with collecting facts about history. Okay? So that's it. Now, history, like other academic discipline, has come a long way, but still has a lot of remaining tasks to do. It does not claim to render absolute and exact judgment because as long as questions are continuously asked and as long as time unfolds, the study of history can never be complete. So as we go along this life, patuloy pa rin ang pag-aaral ng history. Hindi siya matatapos, no? Until may nangyari pang mga bagay-bagay na events sa ating buhay, di ba? Our history doesn't end here. Maybe, kung namatay ka na, doon na natapos yung history. But while you are living in this world, your history runs and still has been collected and recorded. Now, the task of a historian is to organize the past that is being created so that it can offer lessons for nations, society, and civilization. It is the historian's job to seek for the meaning of recovering the past, to let the people see the continuing relevance of provenance, memory, remembering, and historical understanding for both the present and the future. This is the reason why we should be thankful with our historian because through them, we have this provenance, memory, and remembering historical understanding. Kasi pag walang mga historian, walang mga intellectual na nagsulat ng mga pangyayari in the past, so wala, no? We don't have this kind of knowledge today. We don't have this kind of lessons about history. Anyway, it's their job naman, no? To seek for the meaning of recovering the past to let the people see. So their role is they try to recover. Baga, binubuhay nila. They try to, it's doing renaissance. They are regenerating, recollecting, reviving history for us. Kasi kapag hindi nila ito gagawin, how can the next generation know what really happened in the past kung walang mga historians na gagawa nito? So that's the important role of historians. So last one, before we proceed to our graded recitation, we have this last one in lesson 2, Philippine Historiography. So what is Philippine Historiography? This underwent several changes since the pre-colonial period until the present. Ancient Filipino narrated their history through communal songs and epics that they pass orally from a generation to another. So ito na yung sabi ko. Since there are some Filipinos na hindi nakapag-aral, so they pass history through songs, epiko, and they're called oral literature. Oral literature ang tawag, especially the native ones, the indigenous peoples. Alam naman natin, di lahat ng Pilipino nakapag-aral dahil bawal ito ng unang panahon because of the cruelty of the Spaniards. Therefore, they are being passed or transmitted, transcribed through songs, epics, and oral literature. Now, when the Spaniards came, their chroniclers started recording their observations through written accounts. The perspective of historical writing and inquiry also shifted. The Spanish colonizers narrated the history of their colony in bipartite view. Bipartite means to view. They saw the age before colonization as a dark period in the history of the lands of the island, until they brought light through Western thought and Christianity. Early nationalists refuted this perspective and argued that tripartite view, or the third view, no? The first, second, and third. They saw the pre-colonial society as a luminous age that ended with darkness when the colonizers captured their freedom. Yes, that's true, no? It's when Filipinos being colonized that was considered the darkness time in the lives of our forefathers because they lost their freedom. Kinuha ng mga or Spaniards captured our ancestors' freedom. Freedom to expression, freedom for education, freedom to live peacefully. They believed that the light would come again once the colonizers were evicted from the Philippines. So, that's it. Kung may eviction sa bahay ni Kuya, dapat nagkaroon rin ng eviction sa Pilipinas. And that was the time na natalo or natapos yung pananakop ng mga Espanyol. Filipino historian Jesus Salazar introduced the new guiding philosophy of writing and teaching history, that is pantayong pananaw. For us, from us perspective, pantayong pananaw. This perspective highlights among Filipinos about our own history using the language that is understood by everyone. So that's why ngayon, ang history natin, meron ng Filipino or minsan may mga transcribe sa iba't ibang mga local dialect for us to understand what is history. Okay? So ito yung nangyari sa ating bansa. The colonization was considered as the darkness times in our lives. So that concludes, or those are the things under Philippine historiography. If you observe, in Philippine historiography, it's more on analysis, it's more on collection, no? And another example here is the work of Sus Salazar, Pantayong Pananaw. Okay, this is our perspective. Okay, that ends this lesson. Now, later on, I'll be posting our activity in our group chat, and I will also post there the deadline. How or when are you going to submit? Now, any questions? Who can differentiate primary and secondary source and internal and external criticism? If you want to answer, I will post here the StreamYard account. Just click the StreamYard account and you'll be added on my screen and for you to say something. Anyone who would like to say something? What are the important things you've learned today on this discussion? Again, activity will be posted later on. Activity will be posted later on with the corresponding schedule. Where are you going to pass them? Regine, ay kubarot dyan sa kanton. Luto sa kanton. Pakadalawa. Okay, Catherine, Sentinta. Yes, Catherine? Catherine?
Yes, sir.
Yes, would you like to say?
Mabatan ko, sir.
Yeah.
Ang primary and secondary, sir.
Yes, yes.
So the primary sources is those sources that produce time as the event, period, or subject studied. For example, sir, para sa mga memoir, sir, memoir, conventions, even historical studies or sources, sir, ang matang sample niya. Well, the secondary, sir, is produced by an author who primary sources to produce the material. So sa secondary sources naman, sir, kumbaga kung ano to na-search mo, sir, daw gi-rephrase mo lang pero magpili ka sa apat nga sources or tunay nga sources lang, sir.
Okay, from what section are you, Sintinta? 1, 1, anong section mo, Sintinta? 1A ka?
Best 1A, sir.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your brilliant idea, Catherine. Now, Kylo? Kylo? Yes, Persus, pwedeng isulat sa class. Kindly differentiate primary, secondary sources, and or internal and external criticism. Pwede yung isulat yung sagot. I will wait for your answer on the comment box. Okay, yes. You are? Would you like to answer Samud?
Sir?
Ano, magsagot ka?
Oh, sir, sa primary and secondary, sir.
Okay. Oh, start.
Sir?
You may start
Okay na.
now.
Okay, sir, sa primary source po, sir, is yung halimbawa lang kung sa may pangyayari at or yung kailangan kan sa halimbawa sa natin sa research is kung sa primary source is yung mismong ikaw mismo yung nakakita sa isang pangyayari. Sa secondary source is yung halimbawa lamang may nabalitaan ka na sinabi lamang ng halimbawa lamang sinabi ng iyong kaibigan is secondary source ka na dun.
Okay, Samud, what section?
BS Cream 1F, sir.
What? Samud, last name mo, no? Samud ba? Tama?
1F, sir, 1F.
Samud, no? Samud, last name. Pilyedo mo?
Sir, Shailan Samion.
Ah, Samion. Okay, Samion pala. Samion. Original.
Sir, pwede po magtanong?
Yes?
Doon sa internal and external criticism.
Yes, anong
Pwede
tanong
mo
mo?
pakiulit lang kahit short.
Bakit di mo narinig? Kapag internal criticism, it's more on the content. You are going to criticize or analyze a certain document or evidence through its content, the authenticity, Kapag external naman, you work more on the physical aspect of a certain object. The physical one, yung author, the kind of paper na ginamit. So that's it. It's between external and internal. External, physical, yung panlabas na nyo ng isang evidence. Internal is the content, yung hinalaman. Okay na?
Okay, sir. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Okay, great. O, last ha?
Yung tanong, sir,
What's the difference between primary and secondary source?
when we say primary sources, sir, it talks about the documentation. Example, we have accident, sir. You call primary source if you really see the situation in accident. Kapag nakita ay kapag sir, kapag primary source dapat may kan ka, sir. May ano 'yan? May ebidensya ka, sir, may evidence ka, sir. Dapat may ebidensya ka, sir. Tapos kapag secondary sources, sir, it talks about a document or recording, sir. Halimbawa, sir, yung may kaibigan ka tapos sinabihan ka na alam mo yung taong yan, alam mo yung taong yan, mandurukot yan. Tapos ikaw, sir, ikaw na yung idea ay yung sinabi ng kaibigan mo, sir, yung mo na, sir, is ikaw na yung magiging secondary sources, sir.
Okay, very
Lamang,
good. Anong
sir.
section mo last ha? Section mo gani? 1.
Section B, sir. B scream B, sir. 1B.
Good. Okay, very well said. Nakinig ta kasi last ha. Okay. Okay, some more. Apatan. Those who have poor internet connection, just simply write your answer on the comment box. So, andyan yung nakasagot na si Kanapia and Ureta.
No, sir.
Leono and Apatan.
No, sir.
You, Apatan.
Yes, sir.
O sige. Anong section mo yung Apatan?
1A, sir.
1A, no? 1A.
1E.
O sige, Apatan.
L.
E. E, elephant.
Opo.
Okay. What's the difference between, okay, ganito ang question ko sa iyo, Apatan. What will happen kung hindi tayo, kung ang isang author or historian is hindi gumamit ng internal and external criticism? What might happen? Ano kaya mangyayari? For example, me as a researcher,
That's
or what will happen? What will happen to the history, if we don't
the
apply
history
internal and
has
external? Yes?
history may have a false conclusion if the researcher did not apply external and internal criticism.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Apatan. Leon, no? Leono, would you like to recite?
Sir?
What's the difference between primary and secondary source, Leono?
Okay, sir. Uh, Primary source, those source produced at the same time as the event, period, or subject being studied. For example, sir, mga artifacts, mga census, government documentary, and for example din, sir, is when mm, bawa, sir, may isa na na nangyari tapos ikaw yung eyewitness, kumbaga nakakita ka sa pangyayaring yon, so nang makonsider ka na dayon, sir, na primary source. And sa secondary sources, sir, is um, produced by an author who used primary source to produce the material. Example, sir, dito sa di ba, ang friend mo is eyewitness na aragid sa pangyayari. Ikaw, sir, naging hambalan niya. Considered ka na as a secondary sources, sir. Kay pwede mo na matransfer ang information sa iba na tao, sir. Nang
Hello.
even na
Kurong. Ay, school, sa school, gali. Oh.
even na, sir, na na ang information is mali or tama, sir.
Okay, thank you, Leono. From what section are you, Leono?
From BS Cream 1D, sir.
Okay, very good, very well said.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, next, cathedral. Yung iba na walang signal, just comment down na lang. At least ma-recognize. Mabasa ko din yung mga answer niyo. Okay, cathedral. Now, uh,
from
okay, I will give you situation cathedral. 1A?
Sir.
1A ka? Apple, no?
1B po, sir. 1B po, sir.
Okay.
1B.
Okay na 1B. 1B. Okay. Okay, cathedral. For example, may bigay ko na yung situation. Then, let's say, isa kang pulis. Then,
Yeah.
ano ko sa kanila. Then, meron nagkuhan sa'yo. May somebody pumunta sa'yo and he asked something or a help from you. Natulungan siya dahil may nanloko sa kanya. So, how will you believe him? Ano yung mga consideration na gawin mo? Considering the lessons that we've learned today.
Sir, considering the lesson that will him, what are the missing pieces nga gikuha sa iya, kung anong mga evidences niya, sir, tukutan siya. For
Then,
example,
some more?
or simple na lang, sir, if nasakitan ba siya, ilang taon kung naaba siya yung
he would accuse somebody, he would say, ito si Maria, he have done something bad against me. Ngayon, ano yung consider mo?
You need to consider that story is reliable based on the evidences na ipakita yun. For example, may ara sang video. Bisan nga secondary source siya, sir, kung ng video may ara sang proof nga reliable gid, considered gid nga accurate kon ang sources reliable.
Okay, very well said. Thank you so much, Cathedral. So, dapat ganun talaga, no?
Yes, sir.
So, in other words, especially kayo, you are future peacemakers. So, you have to consider the primary and secondary source, the internal and external criticism. If there are sources being
criticism.
presented to you, so you have to apply now. Di ba ngayon, first thing is you would find some sources. Anyway, it will not matter naman whether it is primary or secondary as long as they are legit. So the second thing you're gonna do is you're going to criticize the sources based on the perspective of internal and external criticism. Huwag agad maniniwala. So again, please inform others if the question is differentiate internal and external criticism and differentiate primary and secondary source. Those who have not recited online, please advise them to comment down on this live. Yung sagot nila is i-comment nila sa live na to. Wag sa GC ha. They should not post this. Even this live will end na mamaya, so they are still allowed to give their idea. I-comment lang nila sa comment box ng ating live. So that ends our lesson for today. Thank you so much for being here. So later I will post the activity on our group chat and with its corresponding dates. So see you next meeting. Congratulations. We are now done with chapter 1. And next meeting, I will announce naman kailan ang ating next meeting. Bye everyone and God bless. See you next meeting.